Thank you and welcome to the special business meeting for the District of Squamish for Tuesday, September 12th, 2023. And as always, we're gathered to do our work today on the traditional and unceded territory of the Squamish Nation. Please be advised that this council meeting is being live streamed, recorded, and will be available to the public to view on the District of Squamish website following the meeting. If you have concerns, please notify the corporate officer present at the meeting. Could I have someone move adoption of the agenda, please? Moved by Councillor French, second by Councillor Pettingill. All in favor? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Our first order of business is under staff reports from Financial Services, Asset Management Reserve Recovery Funding Strategy. I will turn it over to staff to introduce themselves and the topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor Herford and Council. My name is Heather Boxrud, General Manager of Financial Services, and my pronouns are she, her, so I can be addressed accordingly. I'm joined today by Roland Russell, Senior Financial Analyst, Planning and Reporting. As well, I just want to acknowledge that the district has been very fortunate to work with Haley Pinkson, a consultant who's had decades of financial leadership and local government experience, and she assisted us with this project today. However, she won't be online. All right, so the agenda for today's meeting is to provide a refresher background on what asset management is and why it is important for local governments to address. We will then review the recommendation of the endorse 2022 Asset Management Report, some important changes that have occurred since that report was issued and endorsed, and recommendations that impact on the current reserve contribution levels. Finally, within the report to Council, staff have provided phased funding options to address the 2022 Asset Management Plan recommendations for Council consideration, which I will highlight and review. So the objective of today's workshop is to address the Council endorsed 2022 Asset Management recommendation and to provide Council with the reserve contribution options for consideration. The key focus of today's meeting is the reserve funding strategies, and just a reminder to Council and the community that the Asset Management Report was endorsed back in 2022. Staff are seeking direction of the phased funding approach to be incorporated into the 24 to 28 financial plan. As well, just a reminder that Council will have the opportunity to discuss capital details at the October 3rd meeting, as well as later this afternoon for the utilities capital. So just a quick background, the district endorsed an updated asset management plan and recommendation in 2022 with the plans to implement the report's recommendation in 2024 to 2028 financial plan. The key element that the report highlights is the importance of funding infrastructure replacement based on long-term reserve funding, utilizing the district's assets' theoretical service life as the basis of determining the appropriate levels of the reserve contribution. So in terms of what is asset management and why is it important, asset management is a proactive management of physical assets in order to support sustainable service delivery. It's a long-term approach. It's holistic and integrated and aims to address the life cycle for the replacement of the district's existing assets. It provides a target revenue contribution for the replacement of existing assets. It's about managing risk. It's an ongoing and iterative process and recommended to be revisited every 5 years. To note, the next asset management report update is scheduled for 2027, utilizing the 2022 to 2026 figures. Sorry, I just missed a piece of that. So what asset management is not meant to determine the annual capital spending. It's not meant to include funding for growth, new or expanded services, or new facilities. It does not address climate change, and it's not meant to fluctuate year to year to meet desired annual taxation levels. So as noted earlier in the presentation, the district's asset management was endorsed by Council in 2022. The report uses the metric, and I'm maybe as long as the one previous to me with the phased parking, but average annual life cycle investment, or AALCI, which is a high-level indicator of the reserve level annual contributions needed to ensure replacement of existing assets to support the long-term sustainable service delivery. So in other words, simpler words, the asset management and the AALCI recommendations tell the district how much it needs to put into reserves on an annual basis to save for replacing existing assets over time in order to provide the services it does today. So the table you'll see on the slide is directly from the asset management report and addresses the capital asset reserve contribution gaps from the districts by fund in 2021, and I'll explain some changes to that in a future slide. The asset management report illustrates 3 asset service life scenarios by fund and compares them to the district's current contribution levels. And you'll see that up on the screen there, but basically scenario 1 is to replace the assets at the same time that they become due in terms of the theoretical service life. Scenario 2 would be to stretch the asset's life by 25% or extend it by 25%. And it can be achieved in practice through enhanced maintenance programs or by accepting a higher risk of failure of assets. And then scenario 3 is 50% greater. It should be noted that extending the assets longer than industry standard will require more funding for inspection and maintenance, which is managed through the respective departments' operating budgets. So updates to the asset management report recommendations. The asset management report made recommendations based on the trade-off between levels of service, risk, and cost. There have been a few updates to revenue contributions in the utility funds. No change has occurred to the general fund. The general fund capital reserve, so the top line there, is funded by general taxation, and current funding levels are significantly lower than the 3 AALCI scenarios. And this is common for many municipalities. The district's current contribution for the general fund is approximately 3.3 million. This level of funding will not be sufficient to manage the cost of infrastructure replacement over the long term and will need to significantly increase to fund infrastructure capital requirements. The asset management report recommendation is to work towards scenario 3 for the general fund in the short to medium term. This would be an increase in contribution of 2.85 million annually and would require a 7.5% increase in general taxation if it was implemented in 1 year. The utility funds, the utility capital reserves are funded by respective funds' utility rates. The asset management plan's current funding level is based on the 2021 budgeted reserve contributions. However, in 2022, budgeted reserve contributions were increased due to increasing customer counts, reflecting true revenues of what was being generated. As well, the asset management plan did not account for unappropriated accumulated surplus that was then being transferred to the reserves in the water and the wastewater funds. So positive news, as such, the true funding gap in asset management targets for water and wastewater are lower than outlined in the 2022 asset management report, and the adjusted asset management report recommendations for the new contributions are scenario 2 for both those funds. To reach scenario 2 would require an increase of 500,000 or 7% in revenue for wastewater and 150,000 or 2% in revenue for water. Solid waste transfers are averaging scenario 1 levels as indicated in the asset management report, so no change there. However, are set at levels that pay for the capital net of financing costs associated with the vertical landfill. So in terms of capital additions impact, the 2022 asset management report does not include capital additions or consider new assets to address growth, climate change, regulatory changes, and other levels of service drivers. So the intent of the asset management strategy is that capital additions and unanticipated inflationary or cost escalations would be captured during each 5-year asset management plan revision. However, the district has significant investment in additional facility and infrastructure assets between 2023 and 2026, which is when the next asset management revision would occur, which would significantly impact the reserve target for the upcoming asset management revision. Therefore, staff are recommending that council consider smoothing the costs over the upcoming year by incorporating a capital additions element to the reserve funding strategy. Adding capital additions across the next 4 years would increase the annual contribution. So 12% increase in general tax revenue of 4.5 in the general fund. 17% in wastewater revenue, or 1.2 million for wastewater fund. 9% increase in the water, or 550,000, and just a small 1% increase for the solid waste, or 55,000. So staff can entertain a pause here if it's council's will to ask some questions before we move into the phase funding, or we can continue.
Kelsey, you have questions at this point? Go ahead, Councillor Hamilton.
Just a quick question. I think I understand, but just to be clear, the solid waste here, this is not considering the expansion of the landfill. This is to maintain the existing vertical landfill, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Councillor Pettigill?
Yeah, 2 questions. The first one, I understand sort of new infrastructure for growth and so on that gets captured every 5 years when we renew the plan. The climate change piece, so understanding we actually need just double the size of infrastructure because of new floods and all that sort. When does that get incorporated? Is that also on the 5-year cycle, or?
Through the chair, finance is anticipating that our managers are looking out for and planning facilities in the future that will allow the district to address climate change issues. So, for example, if we believe a dike needs to be higher, then our engineering group would design the dike at an appropriate level. So, in the future, as they are building new facilities and adding new facilities, they would incorporate the requirements of climate change. So, on a 5-year cycle, as we look at the additional assets that are being planned or have been built, those additional assets and those new assets that will obviously cost more because they're larger, let's say, to accommodate climate change, the value of the asset will be higher. That higher value will be captured within the asset management plan on a regular cycle when it's updated.
Okay, thank you. And the other question, just understanding, you know, I know that we're targeting a 50% longer lifespan, and that comes with higher operational costs to make things last that long. Do we have a way to understand that, you know, we're trading sort of capital or reserve contributions for ongoing operational? Do we have a way to understand how much and where that break point is, where it's like, oh, now we've got to bite the bullet and replace it?
Through the mayor, I'm going to say yes, in that we're not replacing assets at a level that exceeds scenario 3 today. So I would suggest that our operations groups, their planned workload is geared to us getting to scenario 3. And truly, if you were to ask them, we've got a bit of a backlog in our existing requirements for asset replacements. So there's a bit of catch up that we need to do to begin with. But we're not at the level of maintenance that is required or would be expected if we were funding this at level 3. So we're currently working at a level or design, our workloads are designed to meet the level 3 scenario today. And hopefully, as we get ahead of that and can build more assets more rapidly in the future, we would be able to diminish the operating impacts that were outlined previously.
Go ahead, Ms. Bostard.
Thank you. And I'll just add another point of clarification to that. So there isn't a direct correlation necessarily, asset to asset. This is a long-term vision. However, as Mr. Russell said, it is a plan to catch up on that, and it is an absolute trade-off between we have to put money away. In the meantime, we're trying to maintain our current assets. So it's quite a balance there, but it is a long-term strategy and not a direct correlation to individual maintenance to the reserve contributions.
Thank you. Councillor Stoner.
Yeah, a few questions. I think this is related to kind of what Councillor Pettingill was asking, but I'm curious how the capital additions to the asset management plan reserve interact with projects that we add to the capital plan. So as we've put something in the capital plan, we've taken money out of the reserve to pay for it. We still need to budget for its maintenance and replacement. But how do we interact? How do those two things interact?
Sure, I can answer that. So the capital plan is very much the shorter term funding on a day-to-day basis. The AALCI is really looking at the overall, like the entire district's assets on the long term. So we're talking 20, 30 years. So it's trying to maintain a level of contribution that you're actually ahead of that game. When you're looking at just the capital plan, again, that's just short term. That is just what we're funding for the next 5 years. And so when we're funding those directly from reserves at the same time as we're adding new assets, so things that are not necessarily funded by reserves or could be growth or that kind of thing, that's not a replacement of existing, you're adding on to that AALCI. So that is why you have to project forward and really looking at, okay, well, we have a new asset now, but we're going to have to replace that in 30 years kind of thing. And so we need to be saving for that.
So if I were to think about it in like the very best case scenario, if we were really good at forecasting and modeling, would we just be basically paying for our capital plan exclusively out of reserve? If we were able to like put enough into reserve and plan for it accordingly and say, okay, we need to build a new building in 20 years, but we have planned for that in such a way that we know that we have that money in reserve.
Theoretically, yes, it's very nuanced. So not exactly a perfect science, but again, you're looking at new items. And if you're perfect at forecasting, which is really what this is trying to do with an average and knowing that there's going to be expansions in costs, there's going to be new elements like climate change, there's going to be a lot of things that are putting pressure on that capital plan. In theory, perfection, absolutely. But we know that it's very, very nuanced.
Okay, and then my other question is just on the solid waste piece. And this is one that I still have a hard time wrapping my head around because in my reading, the solid waste reserve is actually the lowest out of all the utility reserves, but it's on track to be in the best case scenario. And so how does that work?
So the solid waste is great for the current existing replacement. So the asset management really focuses on existing, but it doesn't, the way it looks at the landfill expansion, it looks at it as a new asset. It doesn't look at it as a replacement. So it is showing that our asset management is great, but that's where we know that there are certain elements and you have that 5-year sweep that brings in those new capital assets. And then recalculates the AALCI. And that's where we have made recommendations to have that capital additions piece of it because of our high level of investment currently in the next few years.
Okay, see no other questions at this point. Maybe move on.
Okay, so in terms of the phase reserve funding strategy options, recognizing that implementing the asset management report recommendations in 1 year would have a significant impact on the taxpayer, staff have outlined a few phased options for council consideration. Noting that there are several combinations possible, staff have reduced the options utilizing the following considerations. So the intention of the phased reserve recovery is to set the strategic direction to address the asset management funding recovery shortfall and capital additions in a stable and smoothed approach. Timeliness was considered to ensure the recovery strategy was achievable within a reasonable period of time. So at the rate of inflation and capital additions that we have in our current financial plan, obtaining the recommended AALCI beyond 5 years becomes relatively redundant. As well, extending longer than industry standard will require more funding for inspection and maintenance. So again, that's that balance. And council would be accepting that higher risk of failure as the assets exceed the service life. We are recommending percentages for each fund instead of specific dollar values, as that better reflects the economic changes in the community and is consistent with best practices. Dollar values in the tables are estimates provided for context only. Council may elect to direct staff to a combination of options across the various funds. Spreading the percentage increase evenly over multiple years provides the community with clear expectations, stability and predictability of the intended outcome. As well, the majority of taxpayers pay for all 4 funds, so the overall cost must be considered. And then following the phased funding strategy options are based on currently available information. It's a bit of a caveat there, are subject to change as the new information is received, as the asset management is revised every 5 years. So in terms of the options that are outlined in the report, so the first option presented is a 3-year reserve contribution recovery strategy for the asset management recommendation, but utilizing the base only, so not including the capital additions. The spread would increase the annual revenue by 2.5% for the general fund, which is approximately $950,000 annually, 2.33% for the wastewater fund, approximately $167,000 annually, and 0.67 for the water fund at approximately $50,000. And again, that is solid waste is at 0% for that one. The advantages to this is 2022's asset management recommendations will be achieved prior to the next asset management revision in 2027, utilizing the 2022 to 2026 actuals. The disadvantages is it does not include the capital additions and will result in higher funding during the asset management revision. And the accelerated phased funding program has a greater short-term financial impact on the taxpayer. So the second or two-part of one option is the 3-year funding, but adding the capital additions. So when including the capital additions to the 3-year reserve contribution model, the spread would increase the annual revenue by 4%. For the general fund, which is approximately $1.5 million annually, or 5.7 for the wastewater fund, approximately $4,000 annually, and then 3% for the water fund, which is $183 annually. $183,000 annually. When adding capital additions, there is a solid waste component at 0.33%, increasing the solid waste by approximately $18,000 per year. The advantages to this is that the asset management recommendation, similar to the prior one, will be achieved prior to the 2027 revision. It addresses the capital additions to minimize that rate increase during the 2027 revision. And then the disadvantage is that it is quite accelerated and has a greater short-term financial impact on the taxpayer. And then extending over a longer period in time increases the risk of unfunded asset failure. So then the second part is a 5-year funding, but base strategy only. So this next option presented will create a 1.5% for general fund. And again, this is not including capital over 5 years, which is $570,000 annually. 1.4 for the wastewater fund, which is $100,000, and then 0.4 for the for the water fund at approximately $30,000. The advantages to this is that it extends the phased approach over the 24 to 2025 financial plan, which is 5 years. The annual financial impact on the taxpayer is reduced, as it's the least ambitious of the reserve recovery funding options. The disadvantage is that, again, it doesn't address the capital addition, so we'll see a higher increase in 2027, and then the asset management plan revision will occur before the recommendations of the 2022 asset management are met, so a larger adjustment. And then finally, when including the capital additions to the 5-year reserve contribution recovery model for the asset management, the spread would increase the annual revenue by 2.4% for the general fund, which is 910,000, 3.4 for the wastewater, which is 240,000, 1.8 for the water at 110, and then again, a small increase on the solid waste, which was 0.2% at 11,000. So this is a recommended fund, or sorry, the recommended option. Switch to this slide. So staff are recommending that council pursue this 5-year including capital additions options, as it strikes a good balance between providing solid and stable revenue contributions to the recovery of the general and the utility reserves. It aligns with the asset management recommendation for medium-term reserve recovery, and lessening the burden on the taxpayer through the high cost and high inflationary times. So although the 5-year option will not meet the recommendation of the asset management plan by the next asset management revision, it does set the reserve recovery strategy in an affordable, predictable, positive, and upward trajectory. So the recommended motion is that the District of Squamish endorse the 5-year including capital addition strategy to address the 2022 asset management plan recommendation and include funding strategy in the 24 to 28 financial plan.
Thank you very much. And I'll go to Councillor Hamilton to get us started with questions in this phase.
Thanks very much. Absolutely, I'm a firm believer that we need to plan on the money we're going to spend, because we know we're going to be needing to replace things and maintain our assets. Can you go back to the recommended table, the table of the recommendation, the 5-year? Yep. So this is totaling, I'll ballpark it at about $1 million, a little bit, maybe $1.2 million $1.3 million per year increase in taxation over the next 5 years. Do I understand that correctly?
For the general fund, 910,000 over the next 5 years. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, I was adding them all together. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So in my mind, I'm trying to now translate that rough dollar value to a percentage tax rate increase to a residential taxpayer. And I think we're having around 370,000 per 1% increase. Is that correct?
That's correct. So we're at 37.7 million in our current tax revenue for 2023.
So this plan would be representing approximately a 2 to 3% tax increase per year for the next 5 years. Is that roughly correct? I know that there are a lot of nuances and caveats on that.
Roughly, yes, but keep in mind that wastewater, water, and solid waste are through the rates, so it's not on the 37.7 million, which is general taxation.
Thanks very much.
And just on that point, before I go around the table further, in any of these projections, this is based on our existing tax base, so that you're not factoring in our non-market growth into these numbers we're seeing in front of us at this point. That's my understanding. Is that correct?
That's correct. So this is just based on our existing taxation. It's also based on the 2023 taxation year. So as that goes up, the value, the annual, which is why we don't recommend looking at the annual so much, it's just for context, but this is asking for or speaking to the percentage of.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Pettingill?
Yeah, this might be too big of a philosophical question or tangent, so cut me off if you need to. But one thing that makes it hard for me to wrap my head around this, I'm very comfortable with the idea of, we use reserves to pay for things. We earn interest while we're saving to pay for it. It makes a lot of sense. But there's things that we really want now, and we confuse need and want, and there are some things we need. And then for new things that's not replacement, we go to debt. And the argument there is, well, if we go with debt, sure, we're paying interest, but we get it now, and the future people will have it, they'll be the ones paying for it, the ones that have it. And so it seems to be this contradiction between getting it now, paying interest, or saving up, earning interest. And we seem to take both approaches in different circumstances. Is there, like, beyond just there's this philosophical whatever, and these are historical decisions we've made, and it's just up to a council to decide to keep it the same or change it? Or are there significant, like, accounting reasons why you really should do it this way? And where this is going to me is, like, understanding, should we be more aggressive on the reserves and get on track? Or if we're very comfortable with this debt thing, maybe we don't need to push as hard. And that's what I'm trying to understand.
Take a stab at that. So there's a few things going on. This in particular is really addressing the infrastructure and what we need to provide the current service levels, and is looking at putting in place a strategy in which we're protecting the community and putting money away so that we are replacing our infrastructure for the services we provide today. Now, in terms of balancing the debt versus reserve funding, absolutely, that is a financial planning philosophical discussion. Perhaps it's an approach. So there's always a balance between how much are you going to be putting away and how much will you go to debt. Obviously, you've just said those arguments in terms of interest being paid or earning interest. What we're currently in is a model in which we have to utilize the debt for new assets in many respects, because we haven't been putting the amount away. We're trying to balance that out. And so that is why when you see the loan authorizations, as an example, come forward, it's not over the entire life always of existing. So for a building, for example, could last 50 years. We don't actually go to debt for 50 years. We go to 30. So you can come out of debt and into the long-term planning and putting money away for reserves. Now, again, it's one of those things where it's very nuanced, and in a perfect world, you might have a target and just go for that in terms of your balance. But different councils, different decisions, and different placement in which we are today. So as we might be coming out of having to utilize debt and putting more money into reserves, which is an appropriate way to go, there is times we're going to have to rely on debt. Absolutely. Hopefully that answers your question a bit.
Councillor Stoner.
Thank you. Through the chair. So they look at the scenarios and the options that staff have presented, and this is the recommended strategy over 5 years. This is actually a more aggressive taxation scheme than the 3-year just base scenario. And so I'm curious, and this might just be a nuanced way of describing the two, but really, if we follow this, we're probably pretty close to actually getting to the proposed funding reserve levels from the asset management plan in 3 years' time, by the time of the next revision. And so what's the benefit of going to meet the asset management plan recommendations and advance the next iteration versus incorporating the capital costs, given that this is a little bit more aggressive, but they're kind of similar in terms of their taxation levels?
Thank you for the question through the chair. Really what we're trying to do is lean on the consideration of stability. And so if we were coming up, if you were to say a 5-year, and they're both pretty well the same, but it's looking at capital, which we do know a good idea of what that price is right now, incorporating that capital, and then doing the same. So it's having that consistency. So we're recommending this particular option is the likelihood when we have a new 5-year plan, we would do another 5 years. So in terms of the new revision. So it's just that consistency and stability. Could go one way, could go the other, but that is where we landed, was leaning on those considerations for the recommendation.
Okay, because the other thing that this really shifts is the amount of money that goes towards some of the utilities. So versus the 3-year base only, there's more money going into the general reserve versus this 5-year strategy, you're seeing more in the wastewater and the water. So when you talk about stability, is that for the taxpayer themselves over the 5-year period?
I think we're looking at stability on both sides. I think the part of the reason that you see significant differences and why you see a larger uh, jump, let's say, with respect to the utilities, in is because the utilities are in the midst of adding some fairly expensive assets. So we're trying to capture the additional costs associated with those assets so that come the next 5-year period, those will already be in the base. And so we won't have that extra makeup space that we would under a 3-year base only scenario. Because in a base only scenario, when we do redo asset management, everything that's been added between now and 2027 will then get added to that number. So we'll have a bigger gap to close in the future. This methodology is trying to allow us to close, I shouldn't say close, not create a gap between now in the next 5 years for additional assets that we're currently constructing. So that's one of the reasons. And in wastewater and water, we have some fairly significant assets that are in the building stage right now. Whereas for two things with respect to general fund has a lot more assets. So it's spread out over a much wider group. And the number of assets that are being added to the general fund in comparison to the total shortfall, therefore, is much smaller. General fund has a large shortfall to reach 50%. Okay. The utilities have a small shortfall to reach 25%. So they have a small shortfall to reach scenario 2, but they have a bigger addition that's coming because they're adding new assets where the general fund has a larger gap to meet scenario 3, but fewer expensive new assets are being added in the next 5 years. So that's the trade-off that you see within those two elements and why the values seem to change in that way. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I have Councillor French and Pettingill.
Thanks, Mayor. When the asset management plan was created, it didn't include the water intake systems on the Squamish River and Masher Creek. And I note that in our next discussion, staff is proposing $50,000 in the 2024 budget for those two intake systems, and then $600,000 spread out over 2025 and 2026 as I'm guessing maintenance. So I'd like to know if the values that we see for the water assets noted in this report include those two intake systems, and do the values in this report include or exclude those two pieces of infrastructure?
Through the mayor, I think that's a two-part question. So I'll answer one piece, and I think the other piece we might have to ask our engineering group to address. We did include in the growth component the additional assets that were identified by our engineers within their 5-year plan, so that we would include that in the amounts that we're building into the asset management plan in the future. And then I'll let Mr. Ralston address the other piece.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I'm David Ralston, Manager of Municipal Infrastructure. So I'd like to clarify that originally the natural asset management strategy didn't include the Masher and Squamish River, but the asset management plan actually did include that infrastructure. based on comments received during the presentation for natural asset management strategy, we actually went back and then incorporated at least some verbiage regarding the Squamish and Masher into the natural asset management strategy. So that is incorporated. And then in terms of that specific capital budget for those creeks, that's actually for maintenance of sediment that has built up, as opposed to a more traditional asset management type of exercise like a replacement. So this is actually just to dredge out material, complete the necessary studies for that in order to ensure that those backup water supplies are available if and when needed.
Okay, great. I'm very encouraged to hear that additional context. And I do have one follow-up. Does staff have any thoughts at this point on the reasonable lifespan for the two water intakes?
Through the chair, the asset management plan assumed a 50-year lifespan. That is a simplistic approach because those intakes do incorporate concrete dams and weirs, as well as buildings, valves. So there's a variety of different infrastructure there. And as we, consistent with how we've managed facilities within the asset management plan, we assume a single lifespan that's sort of an average of the different components. And it was 50 years for those particular assets.
Great. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to Councillor Pettingill next.
Yeah, just between this report and the next one, it talks about our plans to finish off the water metering for industrial, commercial, institutional, and multifamily. So we've done a fair bit of work. We have a bit more to do between now and 2025. And I don't need specific numbers, but I want to understand, roughly what percentage of the water is metered now, where we'll be in 2025. And I guess where I'm going with this is, our current billing, it's sort of based on business type, and it's sort of, I would say, crude, arguably the best we can do, and metering will make it, it's more tied to consumption. So bigger rate jumps, I guess, are more comfortable to me the tighter it is tied to actual consumption. So I'm looking for some understanding of, where we're going to be for the next couple of years in terms of actually tying usage to, or billing to usage, where we'll be in 2025. And I'm also presuming that once we have the ICI and multifamily, we can actually project fairly well the rest of residential. So, once that piece is done. So I'm just wondering if you can speak to that a bit.
Through the chair, as you included information in your question, was we are metering just the institutional, commercial, industrial, as well as multifamily residential, which includes, I believe it's about 400 customers that are going to be metered through that program. And we're roughly 3/4, maybe 80% of the way through metering that program. And we do actually have a session coming up with council to discuss the remainder of that program in October. So there'll be further discussion on that. Next year, we're planning on coming forward to council with a water rate strategy and study that is going to look at consumption based on those users and establishing new water rate. The intent of that will be to ensure that we're collecting the same amount of revenue as what's being presented here, just in a different structure. And that will be based on consumption for those metered users, and it will be based on an assumed consumption for single family residential, which will not be metered.
So does that mean then if we were to sort of, especially if we chose one of the more aggressive options here for the next year or two, there might be a significant swing for some people that then changes again once we get to metering, because we actually see actual consumption. And so there might be over the next couple of years some more significant shifts in individual bills?
Through the chair, there will be certainly a change. We haven't completed that study yet, so I can't presuppose how the rates will be structured, but it will be based on consumption, and we'll be seeking to establish that rate structure in such a way that it's fair for all users, and council will have input to that process as well. So yeah, the overall water utility, as I said, the objective will be to maintain our revenue consistent with what the changes that we're making now. And then it's just how that is distributed amongst the various customers.
Ms. Boxer, I saw your hand there.
Yes, thank you. Just to add to Mr. Rolston's comments, the asset management will be built into the rates, however, is a separate piece of the actual consumption piece of it. So it's a basis of that calculation. However, it's two separate things. There's consumption, and then there's paying for infrastructure.
Okay. Any other questions at this point? We have a recommendation before us. Go ahead, Councillor Hamilton.
I'll move the staff recommended strategy option 2B.
Thank you. Is there a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Anderson. Would you like to speak to it, Councillor Hamilton?
I think this is a well thought out plan. It balances both recovering the funds that we've been spending on infrastructure over the past 10 years, 15 years, and also looks forward to what we know we're going to be spending in the near term future. I think that it's important for our community to acknowledge that our community has been growing out of an infrastructure deficit, and we're continuing to grow out of that infrastructure deficit. And I think this is helping to do that. Thanks.
Thank you. Other comments? Councillor Stoner?
Thank you. I too will be supporting the motion on the floor, and I think that this is a prudent way forward. And I thank staff for presenting the options as laid out in this report. It was a very clear way to try and digest how we move forward with the not so happy news that came from the asset management plan. I do think we're in a really tricky scenario, as Councillor Hamilton mentioned. We're working our way out of an infrastructure deficit while also trying to manage the impact of growth and building new infrastructure at the same time. And that has a really significant compounding effect on our budgets and as a result on our taxpayers. And so I don't support this motion lightly. Like, I think as we look at this going into the broader 2024 to 2028 budget, the numbers are going to start to be really tangible, both for us around this table as well as for our community. And so I just want to be really cognizant as we go into more expansive public engagement on our budget, that we have a really strong narrative about how this is a roadmap and a vision for our community for the next, not just next year, but the next 5 to 10 years, so that a future council or the future of our community doesn't have to deal with this same compounding effect. Appreciating that it's going to have a short-term impact and a fair bit of pain to get us to hopefully somewhere that's a little bit more stable in the long run. So I just want to really make sure that that narrative is weaved into our public engagement. And we will hear from our community as to whether that is palatable at the end of the day, and in the more fulsome component of our 2024 to 2028 budget. But I do think that this is a good one to bake in and test with our community. So thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments? I'll venture my own. I'm speaking in support of the motion. I think this is as challenging as this is the fiscally responsible way forward, and is an example of long-term thinking. So, and I appreciate this council's support of this initiative that will set up some future council well down the road to not be in the awkward position that the last few councils have been in, trying to address the challenges in the community. And as my colleague just articulated, there is some short-term pain or discomfort at least here with this step, but this is what sets us up for future taxpayers to not be in a position that we are working diligently to resolve at this point. So I really appreciate the sort of measured approach and the recommendation, and I'm happy to support it and look forward to discussing this more in depth with the community through the budget process. With that, I'll call the question. All in favor? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much. We do a little change over to our 2024 to 2028 utilities financial plan submission, which is item A2 or 3A2. Or you're just changing seats. That's the only. Okay. Back to you. Okay, take it away.
Good afternoon, Mayor, members of council, CLT, members of the public who may be watching. Today, we're going to continue on our journey towards completion of the 2024 through 2028 capital plan presentations to council. So we're looking at the utility fund workshop this afternoon, and I'm going to start with a slide that outlines the financial plan timeline. Oh, sorry. Wait. More at the red box, utilities and SLRD. So as you can see, it's September 12th, and our sort of finish line is 3 months from now, December 12th, when we get to, sure I counted that right. 3 months from now, when we get 3 readings, then we sort of believe that we're going to get this thing passed this year. There's a number of different iterations that we'll be bringing forward to council. Pretty sure you can read them faster than I can read them because your eyes can move faster than me. You'll note that our idea is to wrap this all up in mid-October with tying it all together. And then we're looking at going to public information sometime in early November. And you'll see that it has a multiple date there because we're still negotiating what that final date will be, but that's the rough time frame. It should be somewhere probably in the first 10 days, give or take, of November. After that, we'll come back with response to the public information and then additional dialogue and present 3 readings in December and adoption before Christmas. So there's that. That'll be our Christmas present to ourselves and the district, I hope. Okay. Yeah. Back to where we are today. We're going to talk about utilities and the regional district contribution to our financial plan. So with respect to the utilities, we have 2 objectives. They are outlined there. What we're asking for is inclusion of the service level changes in the financial plan, and also to include the utility rates in the updated fees and charges bylaw. And we will outline to you this afternoon what those service level changes are, what the overall financial plan looks like for the utilities, and also what the proposed rates and fees are. So with no further ado, we'll walk through each of the utilities individually. With respect to solid waste, the summary here outlines a 5.2% rate increase. The key service level change that we are highlighting is the addition of a solid waste technologist. That staff member will be working at the landfill, and this would allow us to bring in-house monitoring that we're currently contracting. We also would like to point out that over the past number of years, council approved earlier, our previous council approved, within the 21 through 25 financial plan, the use of the solid waste reserve to smooth in the financing impacts of the vertical landfill financing requirements. And so in 2024, this will be the last year in which the operating and financing expenses are greater than our rate revenue. And so this year we will have a reserve draw of budgeted. So it's forecast to be $190,000 in total. And this will be the last year in which there will be a reserve draw. In the future, 25 and onwards, the rate revenue will exceed our projected expenses, and we will therefore be back in a place where we are contributing to the solid waste reserve. And in 2026, the $1 million worth of debt associated with the vertical wall will be paid off. Sorry, that's $1 million annual payment worth of debt will be paid off, and that additional amount will be contributed to the wastewater reserve. So it's been a bit of an uphill battle. We've had some fairly significant rate increases over the past 5 years or 4 years, I guess, for solid waste to ensure that we get our rate revenue up to a level so that it can cover all of our costs. But we will reach that level in 2025, again, with a 5.2% rate increase. And after that, we will be able to contribute that, $1 million a year, which we have been putting into debt servicing. That money will go into our reserves to rebuild our reserve in preparation for future solid waste expenditures. And that's all I'm going to comment on this on this slide. We will pause at the end, the opportunity for discussion. With respect to the wastewater fund, what we want to point out in this instance is the rate increase recommended is 3.4%. That 3.4% is based on the staff recommended option for the asset management plan. And we're not recommending additional rate increases for the wastewater utility over and above that amount this year. We have a major capital project which is underway, and that's wastewater treatment plant upgrade. That upgrade is being funded by a combination of grants and DCCs. The projected costs that are being funded, the project costs that are being funded by DCCs exceed the level of DCCs available in the wastewater DCC fund. As a result, we have extended borrowing through MFA to allow us to accumulate the necessary dollars to pay for that physical asset. And the debt repayment will be made over future years using wastewater DCCs. Okay, so DCCs in this instance become a long-term funding mechanism to support our need to expand our assets today. With respect to the water fund, you will see again that we have a 1.8% increase. And this increase again is equivalent to the amount identified in the asset management plan, staff recommendation. So again, what this is indicating is that within the water fund, the water utility, we were not recommending a rate increase outside of the requirements for asset management, similar to what occurred in wastewater. Again, there's a major capital project underway in water, and that is a building of a new water reservoir. That reservoir is also DCC funded. Again, the project costs exceed the amount of DCCs available in the water DCC bucket. But in this instance, that gap is much smaller, and we're looking to interfund borrow from the water reserve to backstop that price difference. And then DCCs would repay the water reserve over time. It should be noted, I will just make the comment because I'm sure it's been duly noted already, that in both of those two instances, the last two instances, we have growth-related expansion items that are DCC funded. And in both instances, we do not have sufficient funding in our DCCs. We presented the capital plan in July. And at that time, we noted that this was an occurrence. We also noted that we're working with the engineering group to work on proposals to address a review of the DCC bylaw in 2024, so that we will be able to try to address this situation, thereby increasing the amounts that we were able to contribute to the DCC funds and close the gap in this instance. And to be fair, it's also occurring in other areas within our DCC funded asset groups. So from here, I'm just going to hit some highlights. These are the rates that we're proposing. A roughly $10 increase for water, a roughly $20 increase for wastewater. It says sewer, but to be fair, it's an old slide, so try to get that fixed for the next go around. And approximately an increase of $50 for a small tote. For a medium tote, $11 for a small tote, and 32. I am reading the total. I apologize. So that's 10, 20, and 30. That's what I'm trying to say for small, medium, large garbage tote. Those are the rate increases that we're proposing. They come out to the numbers, that percentage increases that we had identified in the for these bylaws, and also in conjunction with the asset management plan. And these are the rates that we are recommending that you include in the new rates and fees bylaw. I should make a proviso. For ease of mathematics, we will probably round those numbers slightly. So it's probably going to be 500 rather than 499, and 635 rather than 636, things like that. It just makes billing easier and easier for residences to comprehend. So those are the values that we're looking at. And that wraps up a brief discussion on the utilities. And I will turn it back to the chair for further discussion.
Councillor Pettingill, French, then Hamilton.
Thanks. So this first question, maybe it's for a future discussion with sustainability, but in prior years, we've tried to moderate the increases for small totes to try and incentivize people to produce less garbage. Do we know yet, or do we have any evidence that that has actually resulted in households producing less garbage, or has there been any benefit to adjusting those rates in prior years?
I'm going to ask, through the chair, I'm going to ask if we can just have a pause on that question. Okay.
I see a staff member approaching you that may be able
Wow.
to address this question.
Shannon sneaks up behind me to answer this question.
Is it okay? Thank you through the chair. My name is Shannon White. I'm the Integrated Solid Waste Specialist at the District of Squamish. I currently do not have any data in front of me about how the number of totes per household, the number of totes per size. However, I can say that the amount of garbage we are seeing at the landfill has gone down less than, or sorry, it hasn't gone down, but it's not increasing as much as we had anticipated in the past. That being said, that could be due to a bunch of different factors, such as because that garbage comes from business community and a bit of the SLRD and things like that. So staff can come back with a bit more detailed analysis if that's what council would like.
Thank you. I mean, if there's a way to understand that, I really appreciate knowing, and maybe we'd want to push harder on the rates if it is having an impact, or if it's not, then maybe we wouldn't. And then, thank you. And a different topic. My understanding from previous discussions is where there are developer cost charge fund shortfalls, we can amend the bylaw and recover some of that. But we also, it was mentioned for some things we need to borrow now because we need to get some of the work done. Can we recover through DCC updates some of that interest we would have to pay for MFA, or is it just, we're limited to capital costs? Like, can we look at full recovery?
Through the chair, yes, DCC regulations are written in such a way that if you have to borrow and fund the debt through DCC, you have the ability to recover principal and interest.
Thank you. I'll go to Councillor French.
Thanks, Mayor. And I just want to be absolutely certain I understand what is attachment 3 in our package, which was the very last slide that was up. The columns are titled Utility 2023 rates, the increase, and then 2023 rates, and then the increase percentage. Is that second 2023 rates column supposed to actually be 2024 rates? And I think
French,
that's,
could you give us a page number in the agenda just so that we can all be looking at it? While
it's page 40 of 111. And it's the very last slide in the presentation. So I think that's just supposed to be 2024, and I just want to be certain that's.
Through the chair, good catch. Yes, you are quite correct. That should be 2024. My apologies.
Thanks for clarifying. That's all I have.
Thank you. Councillor Hamilton.
Thanks very much. My computer just decided to close all my windows. There we go. On the totes, jumping off of what Councillor Pettingill was mentioning, would this, if we were to discuss, would we and wanted to keep the small tote rate the same for 2024? Is this the moment that we would have a motion to that effect? Or would it come as a suggestion and then you look at what the impact would be and you come back to us.
Through the mayor, if I may answer that, we would recommend that you make that, excuse me, we would recommend that you make that motion today. And then that would give us the ability to recalculate both the impact of that rate reduction and allow us to determine, excuse me, how best to incorporate what that impact might be, whether it would require other rate increases, or what other options would be available.
Thanks very much. And I'll just maybe signal right now to my fellow colleagues, that I will likely be putting forward a motion to maintain the small tote at the same rate as 2023.
Thank you. Council, I'll go to Councillor Stoner and I'll come back to you, Councillor Penigo.
While we have Miss White at the table, I have a few solid waste questions myself. The first is every time that we do discuss rate increases, especially landfill tipping rates, we often talk about neighboring jurisdictions and the impact of potentially folks either dumping because rates have increased or just going elsewhere to go put their material somewhere else because it's cheaper. So I'm just wondering if we have done that for our current rate increases, where that kind of makes us sit relative to neighboring communities.
Thank you. Thank you through the mayor. The District of Squamish stays, we work hard to align our tipping fees with the RMOW, so Whistler, to ensure that they do not get our excess, or, you know, that folks aren't kind of going between the two communities. However, so we work very closely with their staff. However, we have no input on Metro Vancouver's tipping fees, which are lower than the District of Squamish's at this point in time. So we have looked at them, but there's not a lot we can do about it. Metro Vancouver does not really want waste coming into their regional district. However, there's not a lot of mechanisms in place to kind of stop that ebb and flow between the communities, unfortunately.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. And then my other question was just going to be, how many years did we hold the small rate? Is it the small tote rate stable for? I think it was 2, but I just want to double check that.
Thank you through the mayor. Staff believe it's 2 years. It could be 3. We just need to verify. Oh, excuse me.
Yeah, I can verify it. It would be 2 years. I'm sorry, it has been 2 years. This would be year 3.
Okay, and then just one detailed question. There's a special project proposal for the disaster debris management plan. And that's something that we have definitely seen come forward at the table with the Squamish-Lillooet Regional District, and is really high priority, and is something that has been incorporated in that budget for their waste management. So I'm just curious where, if any, alignment there is with the SLRD on that project.
Thank you through the mayor. This is a very timely and important question. And staff had originally put it in our budget for 2023. However, it will be, you'll see when we do our carry forwards, kind of in the next step later point, we will be moving it forward into 2024. There's an additional request to increase our 2023 budget by 10,000 in the budget in front of you today. Because staff at the District of Squamish, as well as at the SLRD and Whistler, we've been doing some training, external training on this item, and we've decided to move forward and working as a regional, trying to do a regional plan together. So unfortunately, the District of Squamish's budget or plan is getting delayed so that the other organizations have the opportunity to put it in their budgets and kind of get staff capacity aligned for it. So it will be a regional project in 2024.
Thank you. Councillor Penigo.
Yeah, and I see that we have for service level changes, sort of the rationalization for the new fees. is a co-op students, one for water and one for wastewater in the summer. And that all sounds fantastic, but I'm just never clear what level of discretion then that leaves staff with. So while this seems like a great idea, when it comes down to it, maybe we can't find a student, but there is someone we can hire part-time and spend the money. Does staff have that flexibility? Are we to approve this given the report we've gotten, or we really sort of, if this moves forward, you're restricted and it can only happen if it's a co-op student? I'm just trying to understand that, where that discretion and flexibility is versus because it says co-op student, you could only put that fee money towards a co-op student specifically.
My understanding is that the proposal is to hire a co-op student. Now, to be fair, you may not be able to find a co-op student, but they're looking for a summer student. That was probably a more accurate term. And I think that Ben Konashenko is online with us today and perhaps can add a little more to that with respect to what their intent or plan is. So I'm not sure if he's available right now, but I think we can get a hold of him and have him address that for you.
I'm here, Roland. Can you hear me okay?
We
Yes,
can hear you.
Thanks,
Go
Ben.
ahead.
Perfect. My name is Ben Konashenko. I'm the utilities manager for the district of Squamish. And through the mayor, to answer your question, Councillor Pettengill, we've seen a lot of turnover in utility staff the last couple of years. That's resulted in some loss of experience. And I'm aware of a number of programs throughout the province that specifically train water and wastewater operators. And they feature co-op programs. So the idea here would be to bring in a co-op student and or summer student to kind of bolster our ranks during the summer season to take on some of the additional projects that we do in the summers, and hopefully entice them to return as well as educated, trained, and certified operators down the road.
Go ahead, Ms. Boxford.
Thank you through the chair to just address your question specifically, because of the words co-op student. It doesn't limit us to that, but we are limited by the budget legislatively.
Thank you. Are you good, Councillor Pettingill? Councillor Hamilton.
Thanks very much. I'm going to come back to the landfill. I guess I'm pretty interested in the landfill. Construction, demolition and construction waste, that accounts for a fairly high fraction of our total amount of mass or volume just put into the landfill. Is that correct? I remember the presentation from a year ago.
Yes, through the chair, the mayor, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but construction demolition waste does account for a significant portion of the waste we see at the landfill.
And we have a construction and demolition diversion bylaw in which we seek to try to get, rather than using a machine to tear down a house, but to take it apart responsibly and recycle. We've seen comments from the community. We receive them occasionally when they see a house torn down and not recycled or diverted. When I look at the demolition and construction waste fees, they're increasing by 5%, which is the same as all the others. Should we be looking to increase demolition and construction waste tipping fees more so that we can promote the behavior of diversion?
Thank you, through the mayor. Excellent question. Diversion is such a key element of running our landfill. It is a key piece of infrastructure within the community, and airspace is, to me, like gold. We do struggle with differentiating the landfill tipping fees for garbage from different sources because it gets a little bit complicated when you're asking the customer at the site, where does this come from? The scale attendants don't have a lot of resources to assess where that load exactly comes from. So that's truly what has limited us to this date of why all the kind of quote unquote garbage rates remain the same. The way at the landfill we handle this through our tipping fees, I should say we are trying to approach diversion at construction sites through a variety of different, like all the tools in our tool belt, or toolbox, I should say. So tipping fees is one of those mechanisms, and the way we're doing it is through the band surcharge. So you'll see in the tipping fee rates, if someone comes to landfill, and most of the time, I should say that this band surcharge is applied to construction related activities. It's less likely kind of residents who are coming to the landfill. Usually it's something, so if a customer at the landfill has over 5% of recyclable material by weight or volume, and they dump it in the landfill, then we charge not only the garbage rate, but also the band surcharge, which is instead of 61, it's 522, I think, dollars per ton. So it's quite significant because these are larger volume, larger weight based loads at the landfill. So that's how we're trying to financially incentivize folks to divert with our landfill tipping fees. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. And just to follow up from my understanding, when you say deposit at the landfill, if you've got construction waste that's primarily wood and you take it to the wood waste area, that's not what you're calling put it to the landfill. You mean when somebody dumps it in the general waste bin at the landfill?
Yes, thank you. Yes, exactly. So as long as a resident scales their material and separates it, then they're not charged that band surcharge. Generally, we see these larger customers they're the few folks who have access to dump directly in the landfill. So often we don't see them in the transfer station using the kind of the general garbage bay that there is.
Thanks very much. It seems to me like one of our challenges is that we have one scale where we measure the load, the whole load as it comes in, and we have no mechanism to effectively measure partial loads or waste as it goes into particular streams. Anyways, that's not a conversation for today. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Council, any further questions on this? Seeing now, I'm going to venture one of my own just to slightly preempt. I've heard some interest around the table around the rates, the tote rates, and I've been supportive of this for the last while. I really am curious. Could you remind me sort of what your next steps were if there was interest in that? Because I have a concern that our modeling is based off a certain percentage split of these, and if we're too successful in our endeavors to reduce the size, then we're going to have a deficit situation. So that's sort of a risk I see of pushing further or too far into this, and I don't know whether this is that. So how have you been sort of thinking of that, and do we have? And I think earlier you said you don't have the split or the change that in the size of the totes. We don't have those numbers in front of us. So what would the next steps be till we can get this in place?
I think there's two pieces to that. I believe the comment was that we don't have the volumes associated with specific sizes of totes. We do know what the number of various totes are. And as it sits today, we no longer issue large totes. So the number there is capped. Whatever that value is can only go down. So any new customers have a choice between small, and medium. So if we were to freeze the small rate, then in all likelihood, the charge would have to, that amount of money would have to shift to the medium grouping to be picked up if that was the decision. And whether or not that would actually encourage people to shift from medium to small, I'm not sure if we have that information readily available, but I will defer to you.
What we can do is we can look at the percentage change in the totes, the amount of customers subscribed to each size of tote over the years and see like what has happened with the different rates. And we can bring that to council with the analysis that Mr. Russell's proposing.
Okay, thank you. I just want to understand sort of what the next steps would be so that if there was a motion to that effect, we could make sure we're capturing what those practical next steps were rather than, so I appreciate that, but go ahead, Councillor Hamilton.
Thanks very much. I'd like to put a motion on the floor that we have staff consider maintaining the small tote rate at $210 for 2024.
Seconded by Councillor Greenlaw. Go ahead. Would you like to speak to it?
I think it's pretty obvious why. I think that we definitely want to bring the amount of waste coming to the landfill. We want to bring it down, and we want to subtly nudge our residents towards consciously working towards smaller totes. I would just question Mayor Herford's use of the word "too successful" in reducing waste. I'm not sure that I know for myself and my family, we use a medium tote. I can't imagine how I would function in my house with a small tote. And yet I still think we need to be pushing in that direction because that's the direction we need to go. Thanks.
Councillor Greenlaw.
Yeah, just speaking in support of this motion, we have a four-person household and we have no problem, we would have no problem being with a small tote. And having this conversation today, I'm just like, man, I gotta remember to get on a small tote because we have such great infrastructure with the recycling and the composting that for our family of four, it's definitely doable. And I think to kind of encourage people to move in that direction, think about packaging when they're grocery shopping, think about what they're buying and what they're consuming. Because if you're eating a lot of fruits and vegetables and, meat and making food yourself, you end up having very little waste in your home. So yeah, I think it's a good idea. Thanks.
Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Stoner.
Thank you through the chair. I will support the motion on the floor, mostly because I'm curious about understanding what the conversion rate was for the last 2 years that we actually held the rate steady. We are almost at double the cost for a medium tote already. So I appreciate that there are economic incentives to hold the small tote cost steady. However, at some point that has diminishing returns and you still need to maintain the revenues in order to pay for the expansion of the landfill that is inevitable at some point and to pay down the cost of the landfill expansion that has already occurred. And so I think the reality is that even if you have a small tote, you still have to pay for some of the costs of increasing that infrastructure because you are still generating waste. And so I'm not convinced that actually holding the rate steady for the small tote is going to push more folks to downsize their tote. I think if anything, we can continue to do more communications on the fact that there's already almost a $200 savings and still see a slight increase across the board, which I think is actually still equitable and justifiable. But I am still curious to get staff to bring back some numbers on the conversion rates to see what the best strategy would be. So I'll support the motion for that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, I'll support the motion. I think, I would assume that we will my assumption, and maybe it needs to be put in a motion. I'll look to staff direction for this, but that we would distribute the estimated difference between medium and large. I think for me, I do want to see the actual numbers, but I also see the value in underscoring there may need to be increases across the board to pay for the future landfill and so on, but I would like to see as much as possible the bulk of the a smaller rate increase to the smaller tote to really underscore that message that we all need to be reducing. We are going to have to pay for it, and so at one point maybe we get to a place where it's only small totes and they'll have to pay whatever they have to pay. But I feel like there's value in the interim and sort of really underscoring we need to get our production of garbage down. So for that reason, I will support this.
Go ahead, Councillor French.
Thanks, Mayor. I too will support the motion, and like some of my colleagues, I have some reservations. Education around this is so important, and Miss White knows that, and I don't have to remind her. But it just shocks me how on any given day that I'm in a neighborhood where it's refuse pickup day, the lack of organic totes that are out on our streets. We definitely could improve drastically the amount of organic material diversion that's happening in our community. But I should preface that by saying, I think compared to some other communities, we do a great job of diverting organics. Having said that, though, there is so much room for improvement. And what we're doing with this motion maybe could help to get us towards increased organic diversion.
Thank you. Speaking in support of the motion, I think, there's two measures of success here. One is ensuring we have cost recovery for the service, and the other is reduction of waste. So reduction of waste, we cannot be too successful in that. However, from a financial perspective, we need to make sure that we're still recovering the cost, and that's my concern with this, which could be a problem at some point, similar to relying on motor fuel taxes as transportation evolves to electrified things. So, it's a similar conversation, but I do think that continuing to incentivize the smaller totes and the change in behavior to allow larger families to move to a smaller tote through organics diversion and increased recycling, which are two important pieces from a diversion perspective. I think this is a good direction, but I've heard around the table things like I think and I feel, and I'd really like to see some data on how the actions we've already taken down this path have had an impact or not, so we can see make a more informed decision going forward. And at some point, we won't be able to hold on the rates with these totes. So we'll need to, but that's a problem that doesn't feel like it's imminent, but I want to make sure that we stay ahead of that, and we see it coming by looking at the trends that we're already seeing. But at this point, I'm supportive. And with that, I'll call the question. All in favor? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. I did have another question about the fee structure for the water and the wastewater utilities. This is one that I've been mulling over a little bit, and I know that we are still in the process of implementing our water meters, and that will probably result in a shift in how we charge for water in particular. But we do have the ability to set our fee schedule for water and wastewater based on different types of housing classes, which is something that we can't do with our property taxes because that is set by the BC assessment property tax classes. So all residential gets bucketed into one. However, we have a lot of policy and a lot of momentum to try and support complete compact communities, increased densification, and we know that higher density buildings are a more efficient use of it, like hard infrastructure in particular. And so I'm just curious if staff can speak a little bit about the opportunities for differentiating our fee schedule for water and wastewater based on different residential classes. Recognizing that this year might not be the year to do it, depending on where our water meter installation program is at and how that might impact things. But I do think it's a conversation that we should start having around this table, and I'd be curious to hear staff's feedback on it.
Through the mayor, the water metering program is going to impact multiple residential buildings. Okay, so two things come to mind with respect to that. Once we go to metered rates, people who live in multi-res buildings are going to their costs are going to reflect their consumption. So although your statement is quite correct, we have different housing types and the ability to charge based on those different housing types. Multi-res comes out of that equation once they become metered. Okay, that there is no way to meter something by who you are. It has to be by what the meter says. Okay, so that being said, with respect to residential housing, there's no particular reason why we could not charge one rate for the first house, the main house, and a second rate for carriage houses or additional suites that are on that property. And if my memory serves me correctly, I believe we do have a lower rate for secondary homes that are on existing residential properties. So yes, there is a mechanism to do that. And I believe that that mechanism is already being used within our existing water and wastewater rate structure. So I hope that addresses the question. And I guess once we bring the new rates to you, then you'll be able to attest whether that's significant enough difference between those two, or, you know, and how you might want to see that adjusted at that point. Because as it sits today, we haven't calculated those rates. We've simply put forward what we believe the rate increase will be, and we're going to apply it across the board. So then once that's done, we'll bring that forward in the rates and fees bylaw. And at that time, if you have a desire, or if there's a desire within council to recommend differential fees, that would be the time frame to do it.
Okay, and then just so I can wrap my head around this, with the installation of the water meters, that will change the water rate schedule. Do we anticipate to tie the wastewater rate schedule to that as well, or will that still remain kind of a static fee schedule?
Through the chair, yes, that's a bit of a late addition to our work program, but we are planning to wrap wastewater utility rates in with the water rate structure. There's a lot of synergies to doing that. The actual rate that is charged will likely be adjusted once the sewer master plan is complete, but we do plan to restructure it at the same time as our water rates are restructured.
Okay, and then that work is expected to come forward in 2024, correct?
Through the chair, that's correct.
I was going to follow up on this point just to make sure that I have this. One piece is the metering is the consumption, but I think there's another piece is the cost of the infrastructure to provide that water to the place where it's consumed being different in a higher density than a lower density. And is that concept something that's going to be layered into the pricing and the information that's coming out of this out of the metering project? Because I believe that kind of gets to the core of the question we're being asked.
Through the chair, just to clarify, you're saying is the rate going to be partially dependent on the amount of infrastructure required to service a particular property? The answer to that is no, and that's because of how complex it would be to structure rates in that way, because it really depends on where customers located within the community. So someone that is located further away from our water source, for instance, has more kilometers of pipe required to service them versus someone who would be located closer to our well field. So this becomes quite a complex thing to layer onto consumption. So our approach would be to simply base rates on consumption for metered customers, and then likely based on an assumed consumption for unmetered customers, which is primarily going to be single-family residential customers.
Okay. I'll digest that and get into that further at that time. I have Councillor Pettingill, then Hamilton.
Yeah, and maybe I'm beating a dead horse to death or whatever the expression is, but and not whether we will do it or should do it, but could we, like in my mind, we have ratios. So, and I think this is what my colleagues are getting at. We have, light industrial, medium industrial with different ratios. Could we layer on a ratio to a consumption? So it's your consumption times your ratio. That's what your bill is. Theoretically, is that something permissible? Whether or not we want to pursue that.
Through the mayor, I have an extensive history in calculation of water rates. Normally what you're suggesting is done on the basis of what flow type you have, whether you have a consistent low flow, such as an industrial plant, which runs 24 hours a day, or whether your demands are more peaked during the day, for example. And in rate, water rate calculation methodology, those types of things would be factored in. So you would factor in, your peaking characteristics of the type of business structure that you were occupying. So as an example, obviously residential has, bipolar peaking structure, morning and afternoon, whereas businesses tend to be more even flow over the day, and industries tend to be a lot flatter. Those types of things normally are taken into consideration in the development of water rates and also of sewer rates, because the infrastructure that's required to meet both of the infrastructure required to meet water demand generates sewer demand. So the infrastructure characteristics tend to be the same. So those things are generally factored into the rate design. It's not something that one has the ability to say, this class should have this class should have that. It's more on the basis of flow characteristics.
Thank you, Councillor Hamilton.
Thanks very much. Springboarding and continuing on Councillor Stoner's idea, I want to bring an example that might help. So on Perth Drive, where I live, on the west side of the road is all RS1. On the east side of the road is all RS2. When I count the block that I live on, there are twice as many houses, twice as many utility billing rates, or utility billing customers on the east side as the west side. That means that the east side of the road pays for 2/3 of the infrastructure of my road. Yeah. They're RS2 zoned. The west side of the road is RS1 zone. Can we set utility rates based on RS1 versus RS2 versus other zoning types? Would that be a potential way forward?
Through the chair, with respect to flat rate residential fees, there certainly would be some complexity involved with linking zoning, zoning of particular properties to the utility bill. Okay, because normally they aren't, just straight up. But the fact that zoning is probably tied to, well, zoning's tied to the property. And all of those things would somehow be related within our billing system. There would be ways to do it. I'm not saying it wouldn't require some complexity and perhaps a reasonable amount of, shall we say, modeling and also some time for us to try to figure out how to do it. But I think that it is something that could be looked at in the future.
Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions at this point? Councillor Stoner?
I have one more, which is just around the proposal for the inclusion of a wastewater treatment plant master plan in the 5-year financial plan. But we've also concurrently are doing a fair number of upgrades and a redoing of the Headworks building. And so I'm just curious how those projects interrelate to one another and why we would do a master plan when we're already investing so much in the upgrades and the expansion.
Through the chair, that wastewater treatment plant master plan will be a long-range document looking at what we need to be doing with our wastewater treatment plant over the next 20, 40 years through the current detailed design process. It's been highlighted by our engineering consultants how we really need to have that really long-term lens, particularly when we're working with the Public Works Administration building on the same site and we're competing for space. And it really highlighted the need that we need to be looking long-term to understand what our spatial requirements are. That wastewater treatment plant master plan will also inform the Headworks where that fits into our priority of other work that needs to happen at the treatment plant. So really the need for that master plan was highlighted through the current detailed design and construction that's currently taking place at the wastewater treatment plant.
Okay, that's helpful. And do we foresee that impacting the Public Works building construction at all, given that that's part of the same lot?
Through the chair, at this point in time, no. We've been working closely with them, and at this point in time, there's sort of a line drawn as to where the Public Works Administration building will end and where what space would be available for the wastewater treatment plant moving forward. So that's sort of a constraint that we would be working with as part of the wastewater treatment plant master plan.
Okay. Seeing no further questions, we have a staff recommendation before us. And the earlier motion would be accounted for in the recommendation that's here. We don't need to change the recommended motion to reflect the earlier discussion around the totes. So make sure we're okay. Mr.
Through-
Russell, just before we go to you, Councillor French.
I think if council's desire is something different than was proposed by staff, you want that captured in the motion. So the small tote retaining the 2023
Okay.
rate for the small tote.
Yeah, I think it was a redistribution of the
Oh,
amount
okay, yeah.
collected, so it may not.
Yeah, okay.
Is that enough
but-
of a space, you think?
Yes.
Okay. We weren't saying we collect less, it's just redistribute how we're collecting it for clarity for council. Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Councillor Stoner.
And that was just to bring the information back for consideration, right? Okay.
So with that, this Councillor French, I think I saw your hand first. Okay, so the staff recommendation has been moved and seconded. Would you like to speak to it? No. Okay. Okay. Councillor Stoner.
Yeah, I'll speak to it. I think I'm a little bit confused, and staff may be as well, that we are moving that we approve the utility rates, but we've also requested that more information come back to shift the utility rates. So I wonder if the mover and the seconder could clarify. Thank you.
Thanks. My understanding from the brief conversation that Mayor Herford had, I believe, with Robin, this was that the staff motion is talking about the service levels, the absolute levels, whereas the motion that was put forward regarding the totes would be changing how those levels are distributed within the utility services.
So does that mean you just moved the first of the two motions? So there's that the District of Squamish approved the
I was sorry.
service level changes as well as the utility rates.
I apologize. I was only looking at the first part, so then I will only be moving the first part of the
Okay,
first motion,
so-
or seconding.
That's
I will line up with that so that the first half of the motion is my motion.
okay. Thank you. So let's deal with the first half, then we can come back and just address the second half because I think there's some of these. Yes, go ahead.
Could I just clarify that I have this? Okay, so we're just doing the first portion, and so it's going to be that the District of Squamish approved the 2024 utility service level changes for inclusion, and then we're including, and that the total collected for utilities reflect the small tote rate of $210 for consideration by council.
No, we're going to leave that. Let's leave that part out for now, and then I'd like to address the second that because I believe separately, and then we'll figure out how to do that because the motion originally was to bring back for consideration and
So just the first
just
part.
just the first piece.
Got it. Okay.
Okay, we have a path forward. That's correct. I'm seeing the mover nodding his head. Can you confirm that that's your intent?
So my motion is that the District of Squamish approve the 2024 utility service level changes for inclusion in the 2024-2028 financial plan.
That's moved by Councillor French, second by Councillor Hamilton. Thank you. Any discussion on this point? Go ahead, Councillor Stoner.
Yeah, I'll just say that I'll support the motion. I think that all these service level increases are very justifiable. I know that we've had some challenges in particular with our wastewater staffing complement, and I just wanted to applaud staff for trying to find new innovative ways to try and bring some folks in and think about kind of the long-term sustainability of our staffing in our public works facilities. And so I think that this is a good way forward, and also bring in the solid waste technologist position in-house from contracting, I also think will be good in the long run. So happy to support the motion on the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I'll call the question. All in favor? Motion carries unanimously. Council, there were other rates besides the totes. So I think I'd love it if someone could help us craft a motion that reflects that we're going to have a future discussion specifically around the totes, which we've already made a motion to. But if everyone's comfortable, we could move the other pieces that were not the totes. All right, Councillor Pettingill, thank you for stepping forward. Let's hear what you got.
Okay, let's see how this goes. That the District of Squamish approved the 2024 utility rates, accepting the garbage tote rates for inclusion in the utility rates and charges bylaw, and that staff return with a proposal for updated garbage tote rates.
I'm seeing some noddings. Is that a second or Councillor Hamilton seconds? Councillor Pettingill, would you like to speak to it at all?
No, I think we've spoken to this well. So,
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? I'll call the question. All in favor? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Okay, so next item is the item 3A subsection 3, 2024 to 2028 Squamish-Lillooet Regional District Financial Plan Submission, Aquatic Center. Mr. Russell, over to you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mayor, members of council. My name is Roland Russell, and I'm back to talk more about our 2024 through 28 financial plan. And this frame, we're looking at the Squamish-Lillooet Regional District support of the Aquatic Center. And so with that, we'll move on to our objective. Our objective is to, as it says here, we annually submit a letter and a costing schedule to the regional district, which outlines our plans for the Aquatic Center for the upcoming year. Actually, it's a 5-year plan. And we are requested by them to submit that by October 31st. So we try to get on it as early as possible in the planning phase so that we can just get it done. And today is the day where we're going to talk about the Aquatic Center and the regional district support. So the summary for this year, in 2024, the operating costs are $1.4 million. We've not identified any specific special operating projects in the current year. And we've identified $100,000 worth of various capital projects. There are 3 listed there: steam room repairs, hose bib replacement, and within the teaching pool and whirlpool, the inlet replacements. Okay, total $100,000. It should be noted that the regional district will be covering the operating request, and there is a surplus in the Aquatic Center reserve, let's say, and we will be drawing down on that surplus to fund the $100,000 of capital requests that we've made, upgrade requests for the pool. Now, with respect to that surplus is effectively the difference between the amount that the SLRD pays us annually and what it costs us to operate the pool. So because that is a contribution from a regional entity, we are required to keep that separate and record it on a long-term basis, and then use whatever those funds are to support the pool at future dates. So we've got a little bit of money built up there, and rather than have the SLRD add to their tax burden and have them fund that, which would require additional taxes, we've offered to pay for this out of the surplus that exists. So that is what's going on there. That's the capital project that we're looking at doing this year. We're going to fund that from the surplus. We're going to ask for $1.4 million, which is a slight decrease over the $1.44 million that we requested last year. Those are the highlights of the SLRD Aquatic Center proposal. And I am open to discussion and feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Stoner.
Thank you. Just out of curiosity, do you know how much is in that surplus for the pool?
Approximately $1.6 million.
Thanks.
Thank you. And just in other reserve funds, we have a target amount. Do we have any guidance on what our target amount is for that surplus as we're contemplating how much we're drawing from it?
I'm going to say we don't, but I'm also going to make the comment that given that this is effectively money that we've asked them to give us and they've taxed their taxpayers, what we've done is we've tried to apply the same type of rationale to this reserve that we're using in our other reserves. So we're going to pay for smaller projects, $100,000, $150,000, $200,000 projects, and larger projects that might be $500,000 or $1 million. Then those projects we would approach the SLRD and suggest that they fund. So we're trying to use the same type of methodology, but we don't have a specific target.
Thank you. Ms. Boxford, do you have?
I'll just add to that the target is, there's no target because this particular reserve is not necessarily strategic in that sense. It's actually born from surplus. So it's born from requests over time.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Pettingill.
Yeah, just want to, so the SLRD is funding this, and as Squamish taxpayers, we actually do pay a bit into the SLRD. But this is one asset at the whole Brennan Park Recreation Center, and there's fields, there's all kinds of programming. Although the SLRD provides funding for this one asset, members of the region, the SLRD, Squamish or non-Squamish, have equal access to the fields and programming, and not just the pool, but the whole thing. Is that correct?
And to the best of my knowledge, yes, that is correct for the mayor.
Okay, any other hands? Questions on this? Moved by Councillor Stoner. I'll second. Would you like to speak to it? Okay. Any other comments? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. And now, Council will be looking for a motion to close. Moved by Councillor Stoner, second by Councillor Hamilton. All in favor? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. We'll now recess for 10-ish minutes until we're ready to reconvene and close.